All right, so this week we are moving on to the next phase of Egyptian history, which is the Middle Kingdom. And there's a few things I want to talk about when we really get into this. But let me show you the timeline here. And we've looked at this same timeline before. So now we've moved into the Middle Kingdom, which is 2055 to about 1650 BC. I didn't put BC on there, but it should be on there. And the dynasties are 11th through the 14th. Now the 14th is a little bit sketchy in terms of what we know, and it's sort of sketchy during the 13th as well. And we'll talk about that in next week when we get into the Middle Kingdom Part 2. There are tons and tons of sources for the Middle Kingdom, as opposed to like a source list for the Old Kingdom. So you find many statues. In fact, some of the statues are still being discovered, especially for Amenemhat. But as you can see here from the slide, there's 70 alone from this one pharaoh. We've got a number of tombs, and you remember steles are sort of like tombstones with written material on them. We've got tons of writings. I'll talk about one Pepperological Archive here in just a bit. We've got literature, archaeology, especially in the Delta, which is nice. We've got artwork, and of course we have some of the kings list. So we've got lots of information about what's happening in the Middle Kingdom. Now, last time we were talking about the first intermediate period, which probably began because of climate conditions being drier. And then you've got rulers in the north and south. Now, what happens during the Middle Kingdom is that a king named Mentuhotep, who ruled from 2055 to 2004 BC, he ended up reunifying Egypt. He was ruler in the south, and he pushed northwards. And again, we have lots of material on his rule. So I've listed a few things here. We've got literary documents, buildings, including pyramids, and art. And here is a statue of Mentuhotep II. What's really interesting is, if you remember in the first intermediate period, we were looking at a period where the central government disappears. There's rulers in the south, there's rulers in the north, but there's not one of the entire country. And Mentuhotep II brings all that together. So as I put here, you start to get a strong central government reappearing. And of course, you should be thinking sustainability as I talk about all this. So when you have a strong central government, the agriculture is pulled together, the religion is pulled together, the economy becomes much larger than it was during the first intermediate period. So it goes back to the same type of things that were happening in the Old Kingdom. Here's another famous rock relief of Mentuhotep smiting somebody or hitting somebody down. You can see him down by his knees. Okay, so it isn't 100% clear what was happening when Mentuhotep II was putting everything together. It looks like it was a period of conquest, but there are some questions. I mean, he was certainly ruler in the south with his capital at Thebes. As I put here, some of the evidence makes it sound like it was negotiated victory. So he did some type of negotiation with the rulers in the north, and then that's what brought together the entire country. Now, if we look at the number of years that he was ruling, so I gave you the dates of when he was ruling before. The way that they did their calendars, they would say the first year of Mentuhotep II, the second year, the third year. In his 39th year, he's got a new title, and it's the uniter of the two lands. So now we've got a pharaoh, we've got a central government, and so on. And what he does is he says, hey, look at how great I am a god. So that's what self-deification is. Now, you still see regional officials. So if you remember in the Old Kingdom, we talked about the nomes and the nomarchs, the governors. During the first intermediate period, you saw the rise of the nomarchs, these powerful people who were ruling in sort of independent states during the first intermediate period. These people are still around. And so you find these regional officials still in power. And of course, you can see their power in their tombs with all the material that's buried in the paintings and so on that are in their tombs. It's interesting too, you also see more weapons found in ordinary tombs. And as I put up here, is that a measure of instability still? It's really hard to tell. This is probably one of the more famous buildings from Mentuhotep II. This is his burial area. And then this is an overview showing the tomb of Mentuhotep. And what you're, let me see if I can write here. So this is the one we're looking at here. We will look at this one after. This is the area of Hatshepsut, one of the queens of Egypt. So anyway, he built this tomb, and if you remember, we talked about this, that the Saf tomb, S-A-F-F, which were tombs built into the sides of cliffs, as opposed to going down into the ground into a burial chamber. And then, if you remember, in the evolution of the pyramid, the burial chamber moves up into the pyramid. During the first intermediate period and towards the end of the Old Kingdom, they build these Saf tombs. Now, this is a massive form of Saf tomb. Okay, in terms of what we know about the government, so I already talked about the fact that he unified everything. He creates a new post here, the governor of Lower Egypt. Now remember, Lower Egypt is in the north. That's the area that he had to conquer. So he's put one of his chosen people in power up in the north to make sure that they don't break away again. And then, no big surprise, you've got these powerful nomarchs. He starts to reduce them, reduces their power. He gets rid of a number of them so that he keeps his full control of what's happening in the government. We also find new trade. Now, that's not surprising when you've got a strong central government. They're in need of things, especially for wood, especially for cedar. And so you find lots of trade. And I've got a map here in just a bit showing you some of that trade. It is still hard for pharaohs to control a lot of the outlying regions, however. So you might have a strong central government, but not all of it is under his direct control. And this is showing some of the contacts that the Egyptians had. So of course, here's Egypt in the bottom. You've got contacts with the Aegean, the Minoans. You've got contacts with people living in Syria. And then you've got contacts happening again in Nubia. And if you remember, during the first intermediate period, a lot of the trade broke down, but not all. We talked a little bit about that. Now, as we move on into the 11th dynasty, not too much is known about Mentuhotep IV. In fact, he's not even mentioned on some of the kings lists. And that starts a new dynasty, which is 12. And it's really easy to remember the names of the pharaohs during this period because they switch from Amenemhat to Senusret. So Amenemhat I, Senusret I, Amenemhat II, Senusret II, and so on. Now, we know that Amenemhat II moves his capital to a place that we don't know of now. So it's Ichtitawi, and we don't know exactly where that is. Scholars are still looking for it. It's hard to say exactly where it is, but hopefully that will be discovered soon. Now, we find that in Dynasty 12, so Mentuhotep II was in Dynasty 11. This is the new dynasty under Amenemhat I. We start to see more building projects happening. So this is the remains of a pyramid. So I know it looks like a pile of rubble, but this is what the very first pharaoh of Dynasty 12 built, Amenemhat I. So, and as you can see here, if you remember Pepi II, he was the longest ruler of the Old Kingdom. So Amenemhat builds a pyramid that's 155 feet tall, and it's the biggest one since the Old Kingdom. And then what's really interesting is that they didn't build all, I mean, they built the pyramid then, but a lot of the material was borrowed from buildings from the Old Kingdom. So their economy still wasn't set up. They didn't have enough trained people yet to work with stonework. So they're borrowing, and actually not borrowing, they're sort of taking things from the Old Kingdom. And when you do see artwork, what they're doing is they're imitating what was happening in the Old Kingdom. Now, we do have quite a bit of text from this time. And what's really interesting is if you remember at the end of the Old Kingdom, you find it getting drier and the Nile is not running and not having as high of floods. So it looks like during the Middle Kingdom, for most of the Middle Kingdom, you had normal sized floods, or as we'll talk about, you had some enormously high floods that probably caused quite a bit of damage when they first started happening. But Amenemhat probably wrote something called Instructions for his son, Senusret I. And what he said in these instructions, one of the sentences, that the Nile honored me on every broad expanse, meaning they were getting good floods, therefore good agriculture, therefore the population went up, and so on. Excuse me. So I mentioned at the very beginning, we've got these pepperological archives. If you remember, papyrus grows along the Nile and it's made into paper. That's where we get our word paper from. So we have these amazing papers called the Hekanakte papers, and probably dates to sometime around Senusret I. And these Hekanakte was a farmer, and he writes these to his family. So we also find other things happening in these. But what's really amazing about these papers is that they give us the social conditions about the farmers there, and really about farming, farming in general, and family relations. Okay, I mentioned just a little bit ago about trade. So you find that Senusret I, during his period, there's a new push to take over Nubia. And if you remember from a few weeks ago, I mentioned Nubia. It's very rich in gold. And of course, to the south of Egypt, where during the Old Kingdom, part of it was under the control of that period. It was lost control of it during the first intermediate period. And now they regain it during the Middle Kingdom. And next week, we'll look at closely some of the fortresses that were built all over Nubia, which shows the control that Egypt had during that time. There's some pretty interesting collections of treasures from this particular period. So the son of Senusret I was Amenemhat II. I told you how they end up naming all their fathers and sons. There's something called the Todd Treasury that was discovered. These were in bronze boxes, and you can see them in the back here. And there were objects from all over the Mediterranean. So you've got the Aegean, which is the Aegean Sea, so material from societies in that area. You've got material from Mesopotamia. So it gives you a really good feel of the trade that's happening during this period. Now, of course, we really are focusing on sustainability in this class. So I want to show you a few things that's interesting. So in the late 12th dynasty, I had just talked about how you get like regular floods during the Middle Kingdom. Towards the late 12th dynasty, you start to get these massive floods. So this chart is showing you that. So LWL's lower water level, and you can see that this is 0. So this is where things are sort of even. Now, what you're looking at here is you can see meters here. And so let's just pick, like this is 20 meters over the lowest water level. Now, 1 meter is 3 feet. So you're talking about 60 feet over flood level, over where the water normally sits, 60 feet above. And so you can see this is Amenemhat III, Amenemhat IV, and then so on. So you get a large number of very high floods. So this is 60 feet over the lowest water level. And so this is pretty amazing in terms of the volume of water. And we know this because the Egyptians made something that we call the Nilometer, which is just measuring the Nile. And in some of these forts that we'll talk about next week, what somebody ended up doing is scratching the line of where the high water was. So they scratched it and said, this is the time of Senusret I, or whatever it was, like his 9th year, or whatever it was. It isn't clear whether they put those marks on the rocks to keep track of the Nile, or if it was like, oh my gosh, look at how high the water is. Let's remember that it was at this height. So you get these massively high floods. Now, what's really interesting too, when you look at Senusret II, he ended up draining parts of the Fayum. Now, we haven't talked too much about the Fayum. This was a lake that is in sort of the middle northern part of Egypt that it's fed by the Nile. And what they ended up doing during this period is draining, draining part of it. They built canals, they built dams to control the water. And it's interesting, it's thought that maybe all this was done to control the high floods. So you get these massively high floods going through the Nile River Valley. If you can direct a lot of that massive water somewhere, that might save a lot of farmland further to the north. So it's thought maybe a lot of the work done during this period was to help Egypt sort of control itself during these periods of extremely high flooding. And of course, if you imagine, we're talking about, overflowing its banks, the Nile overflowing its banks, very high water levels, a lot of the farmland is going to disappear. So the Egyptians had to adapt. And what they probably ended up doing is farming much further away from the Nile River channel. And then they did adapt. We know that, the government was a strong central government, great agriculture, great economy, lots of trade during this period. So they ended up adapting, and it's probably because they were able to control at least a little bit better the flow of the Nile. So when we talk about the Middle Kingdom next, which is next week, I'll go into a little bit what's happening towards the very end of the Middle Kingdom.